try to advance in this competition. If you missed your favorite team, you can always catch up on the matches on YouTube at TIU_Jamaica and on Facebook at TIU Jamaica. Continuing the action this afternoon, we have with us Team Jamaica Information Service, and they will be playing the Early Childhood Commission. They will be debating the moot. Be it resolved that the government should strengthen workplace health and safety standards, even if it increases the costs for businesses. I repeat, be it resolved that the government should strengthen workplace health and safety standards, even if it increases the costs for businesses. Very, very interesting moot and very relevant to all of us, workplace safety. Before we begin, we want to invite the teams to introduce themselves, starting with the Jamaica Information Service.
Good morning, my name is Jodianne. Good afternoon, my name is Jodianne Palmer.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Gay Hodges.
Good afternoon, my name is Paul Allen, and I'm the reply speaker for the proposition.
Thank you so much, Team JIS. We now turn our attention to Team Early Childhood Commission as they introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Team Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chabelle Campbell.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jada Cruz.
Thank you, Team Early Childhood Commission. We also have with us this afternoon our partners, the Jamaica Association for Debating and Empowerment, and they will be the adjudicators in this afternoon's match. We invite the judges to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Tomika. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this match. My name is Jermaine Barrett. I'll be the chair adjudicator.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kaliseti Vasa. I'll be serving as a wing adjudicator. All the best to both teams.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roshana Jarrett, and I'll serve as your second wing adjudicator for this match.
Thank you so much to our team from Jade. Ladies and gentlemen, the teams are all familiar with the rules. I now turn over to the judges. All the best to teams.
Indeed, Tomika, the teams are very much furnished and aware of the rules, but our viewing audience might not be so cognizant. So we will bring them up to speed. The two teams have three debaters, as you would have realized. Each debater has a different amount of time within which they will deliver their presentation. The first debater will speak for 7 minutes, the second for 6, and the third for 5 minutes. After the first two speeches, that's first proposition, first opposition, we'll enter an exciting period of cross-examination. We'll have another period of cross-examination after the second pair of speeches. Thereafter, we'll have a 1-minute pause, after which we'll have the replies, beginning with the opposition reply. Teams, please be mindful and pay attention to the signals. We'll have a signal issued like that, indicating that you've spoken for 1 minute, another just like that, indicating that you have 1 minute remaining in your speech. This is particularly important for the first and the second speakers, because in between the ding of those two dings, rather, we will permit the flow of points of information. We will have two dings of the bell at the end of your allotted time, and 15 seconds thereafter, we'll have continuous dinging of the bell to signal that you should stop and yield the floor for whatever else follows. All right, so debaters, do you have any questions? I get the sense that you're edging to get this match started, so let's do just that. We call upon the first speaker from the proposing team to open this debate. Hear, hear.
Esteemed adjudicators, distinguished opponents, good afternoon. We firmly propose the moot. Be it resolved, the government should strengthen workplace health and safety standards, even if it increases the costs for businesses. This endorsement
is grounded in the use of the word strengthen, which means to make something stronger or more effective. Its presence also affirms the existence of health and safety standards currently being used as guidelines for a nation's workforce. Nevertheless, the crux of the argument lies in its efficacy and enforcement, as well as its moral and legal obligations. The International Labour Organization, ILO, defines workplace health and safety as the maintenance of a working environment that is conducive to health and safety of all workers. It further defines workplace as all places where workers need to be or go by reason of their work and which are under the direct or indirect control of the employer. Additionally, the ILO states that health in relation to work indicates not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, it also includes the physical and mental elements affecting health which are directly related to safety and hygiene at work. Building on this definition, the burden of implementation rests squarely on the government's willingness to enforce measures that seek to protect and preserve the physical and mental welfare of its citizens. Colleagues, this contention begs the question, what is the actual cost of human life and limb? We will highlight 5 pillars. 1, the protection of human life and dignity. 2, increased productivity and worker efficiency. 3, reduction in public healthcare burden. 4, long-term economic gains. And 5, adaptation to modern workplace risks. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition will argue in defense of less stringent health and safety measures, citing catastrophic impacts to businesses. They will contend that each business should be able to independently determine its level of adherence to such measures without the burden of excessive government regulations. The proposition vehemently rejects such a stance, as the country's current legislative framework is weak, outdated, and limited in scope. The Occupational Safety and Health Act is currently not operational as it is yet to be gazetted. My opponents, the government of Jamaica should indeed strengthen and implement workplace health and safety standards as part of its responsibility to protect citizens from harm, which is one of the primary functions of the law. It stands as the absolute power to intervene when an individual's fundamental right to life and physical safety are compromised or denied, as this would be a violation of human dignity and the internationally recognized ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. The Inter-American Development Bank and the ILO reported that the average occupational fatality rate to be approximately 0.135 per 1,000 workers within the Latin American and Caribbean. That accounts for almost 3 times higher than the rate in established markets. That rate is 0.053 per 1,000 workers. Major risk factors specific to the region are noise exposure, ergonomic factors, exposure to chemicals, and so on. An example of a non-communicable disease affecting approximately 260 million persons is asthma. However, 25% of adult onset asthma is linked to exposure to asthma-causing chemical agents. One such agent, not accepted. One such agent is used in spray paints and adhesives, which are heavily used in garages and furniture shops across the country. Consequently, the weakening or absence of health and safety standards transfers the actual cost from the ledger to the life of the employee. Please note, profit is a renewable resource. Human life is not. The financial cost of adherence is a necessary investment in securing the preservation of human capital and inevitable productivity. The second pillar of our argument posits increased productivity and worker efficiency by strengthening workplace health and safety standards. The opposition might argue that robust OSH regulations is a deterrent to foreign investors as it creates bureaucratic red tape and does not encourage economic growth and innovation. The proposition contains that the preservation of the workers' well-being should not be up for barter. This is not a matter of checks and balances. It is a matter of integrity, morality, and respect. The ILO and ResearchGate estimates the economic cost associated with occupational accidents and illnesses in the Caribbean to account for 2% and 4% of the regional GDP. This is due to absenteeism and loss of productivity. An example of loss in productivity and economic gains is the Supreme Court of Jamaica's awarding of $6 million to a worker in a bag juice factory. The worker lost 4 of his fingers while trying to clear an obstruction in the machine. This, he says, he had to do on multiple occasions on the instruction of his employer.
Point of information.
Not accepted. The court found the employer liable as it determined the employer derelict in their duty to provide appropriate and adequate training with poor implementation of safety procedures. Inasmuch as businesses may complain about the direct cost for implementation of such health and safety measures, the procurement of personal protective equipment, and the carrying out of regular inspections, the direct cost of an unsafe work environment has far-reaching consequences and greater economic costs. The strengthening the proposition yields.
We thank the first speaker on the proposition, Team GIS, or Jamaica Information Service, for that submission. We now call upon the first speaker from the opposition side to open the opposition's case. Of course, the opposition team is the Early Childhood Commission. Hear, hear.
A reading from the Word of God, taken from 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 3. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But this prophecy warns us about pursuing safety without wisdom or foresight. And that is exactly the danger that precedes us if we follow the proposition's course of action. Judges, viewers, fellow opponents, good afternoon. I stand before you today to challenge the mood. Be it resolved that the government should strengthen workplace health and safety standards, even if it increases costs for businesses. So let's be clear, side opposition. We absolutely support safe and healthy workplace. Employees deserve protection and proper work conditions. So the question is not if safety matters, Mr. Speaker, but rather how it is achieved and what consequences to our society. The proposition, on the other hand, are selling strengthened standards with a fine print, Mr. Speaker, increased costs for businesses. And cost in the Jamaican context is the deadly word because it may be very well the cost of our economy, our livelihoods, and our lives. We accept the definition proposed by the proposition. To support our stance today, we will present 3 arguments. As first opposition speaker, I will advance the strengthening standards without proper enforcement is meaningless and increased costs will disproportionately harm MSMEs. Our second speaker will discuss the socio-economic plights of these increased costs. And not accepted at this time, and our reply speaker will tie our arguments together. Mr. Speaker, how can you trust the referee who won't use the rule book? Historically, when sweeping mandates are introduced, who is the largest laggard? The state itself. The government cannot effectively strengthen standards, especially at the cost of businesses when they are chronically failing themselves and to implement the ones that they currently have. Yet the proposition wants this same government to walk into the local bakery in downtown Kingston and issue heavy fines for non-compliance. Not accepted at this time. Madam Speaker, taking regulatory advice from the government is like seeking financial guidance from someone who is bankrupt. Side government, take the beam out of your eye before you take it out of others. The issue in Jamaica isn't lack of rules, it's poor implementation and weak enforcement. Let's look at the evidence. According to JIS in 2009, despite the amendment of the Factory Acts, over 600 factories, Mr. Speaker, remain unregistered and able to avoid the watchdog function of the factory inspectorate. Again, this is not failure of standards. This is weak enforcement of standards and unmet capacity. Even the government, not accepted at this time, even the government-owned workplaces or HS issues have been recurring. In 2013, Central Sorting Office employees were hospitalized for inhaling toxic fumes. In 2017, noxious fumes forced Cornwall Regional Hospital staff to work outside on the tent. And this year, in January 2026, doctors at Cornwall Regional Hospital were forced in a sick out over severe, unsafe working conditions. Mr. Speaker, this is not a trend. This is decade-long patterns of systemic failure of negligence. If enforcement is weak now, strengthening the standards, Mr. Speaker, just creates more rules without real protection. The government is operating with a 1.4 trillion national budget, the largest purse in the country. If the states cannot even secure quality air for its own offices, how then can they regulate the entire country? As my granny would have said, dance a yard before you dance abroad. Get your house in order, side opposition. Our second argument is that the overwhelming financial burden, increased costs will place on micro, small, and medium enterprises. According to JIS in 2025, Mr. Speaker, MSMEs account for 97.6% of the economy, employing 80% of the jobs, contributing to 44% of GDP, and account for nearly 12% of the tax revenue last year. The Young Entrepreneur Association of Jamaica on April 18, 2026 warns that these MSMEs are already facing a triple threat of energy, transport, and demand issues. Global instability and supply chain disruptions are already choking them, and the proposition wants to add burdensome new regulations. What happened next? We are not saying all businesses will collapse, but in the vulnerability and fragile economy of our developing country, a country highly susceptible to covariate and idiosyncratic shocks, even the slightest increase can have disproportionate consequences. Mr. Speaker, we've seen similar outcomes before. Under the 2015 Natural Resource Conservation Permits and License Amendment Regulations, application fees moved from $1,000 in 1996 to $50,000 in 2026 and $75,000 to $115,000 if an environmental impact study was needed. Mr. Speaker, a worker without a safe workplace has a problem, but a worker without a workplace has an even bigger issue. Protecting workers should never come at the risk of eliminating their jobs. This plan is not a regulatory framework, it's an eviction notice. Mr. Speaker, our position is simple. You cannot regulate your way out of existing systemic issues. Poor and weak enforcement coupled with stronger standards equal a more expensive failure, not better safety. The prophecy warns us about seeking peace and safety without wisdom. Today we urge this House to choose effective enforcement and sustainable solutions that does not impose increased costs for businesses. We beg to oppose.
We thank the first opposition speaker who have just tabled some arguments in this debate. We now move to the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition team, Team Early Childhood Commission, gets a chance to ask 3 questions of the proposition team, Team Jamaica Information Service. Each of those questions is limited to 10 seconds. Each response limited to 45 seconds. Let's get this segment on the way. At this time, we make welcome the questions from Team ECC. Here.
Why should we trust the government to strengthen health and safety standards when they themselves cannot implement the existing ones?
The government has a responsibility to regulate. And when the government puts that regulation in action, it is not absolved of the responsibility to itself be regulated and to self-regulate in that instance. Therefore, they have to, it cannot be that you're saying that because they cannot follow the rules, that they should not be making the rules. That is the responsibility of government.
Additionally, if not the government, then whom? Because in your first speech, you said that MSMEs cannot afford to put in place certain measures. So if they cannot afford to put in place the measures, it means that they will cut corners at every point that they have in order to not ensure that there are basic safety and protections in place for their employees.
My second question, you mentioned that the current health and safety standards are subpar. But once implemented at the minimum level, many of our standards are actually in line with international standards.
You didn't ask a question.
So how can you define the government standards as subpar?
We currently have an act in place that was created 80 years ago. So the Factories Act only speaks to a limited number of sectors within this country. Most of the people here would not be covered under that. What we're proposing is that the Occupational Safety and Health Bill that was proposed in 2017 be implemented to ensure that there's wider protections for staff members and not just for a few who are covered under the Factories Act, which you mentioned is difficult to regulate because it's outdated.
So you mentioned the Factories Act as the sole one. We have many others, such as the Sexual Harassment Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Act / Bill of 2017. How then can you say these are antiquated?
Sexual harassment is only one of many issues that people face within the workplace. We need to ensure that there are protections that speak to their health, that speak to their personal issues that are happening at work, that speak to modern day health-related issues that would not necessarily be covered under the Factories Act. So the Sexual Harassment Act is a move in the right direction, but it's only a part of it.
And please remember that the OSH bill has not yet been gazetted.
But it is in operation. It is in operation. Sorry.
Response in your substantive case, all right? Good. So we thank you both for this phase of cross-examination. We continue, though, the exciting exchange of questions and answers with the questions coming now from the Jamaica Information Service. Questions? Oh, not just yet, JIS. Let's hear those 3 questions posed to the Early Childhood Commission.
You spoke to the costs incurred by MSMEs and that it's unsustainable, but what is the cost of a human life if we don't put in place the safeguards?
I'm glad you spoke about that. If MSMEs account for 80% of the workforce, what is going to happen to those employees when they are without jobs because of the increased cost and burdens on the MSMEs? You speak about the value of human life, but what life can you have when you cannot afford to live?
And we are also not placing any price on life because we do believe that life is priceless, and what we're saying that safety matters, but at what cost?
Why should the government pay for hospital care after accidents instead of preventing these accidents in the first place?
We currently have policies in place. Accidents still happens. Strengthening workplace health and safety standards will not abolish accidents, but we will have to work how to prevent them.
If small businesses cannot afford to put in place basic protections for their staff, can they truly be operable? Are they sustainable? Why are they in business then if they cannot ensure that there are safeguards for their own employees?
Thank you for that. Even though you mentioned that the OHS Act has not been gazetted yet, the government has been supporting businesses through rollouts of programs such as the Safe Worker Program and the Voluntary Compliance Program. The Voluntary Compliance Program helps to get businesses up to the standards. It helps to provide them with what they need to help meet the OHS requirements when it is actually implemented. So thank you for that question, but our businesses are adequately supported and they will continue to be supported by the government ahead of the implementation of this act.
Thank you very much to both teams for this exciting segment of cross-examination. Much to think about, but we continue the debate now with the presentation from the second speaker from the proposition team, Team GIS. Let's make them welcome. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to reinforce and deepen the case for this motion. The opposition may try to reduce this debate to dollars and cents, but this is fundamentally about people, about protection and progress. And at its core, this debate comes down to clear clashes: cost versus investment, limited protection versus universal rights, and inaction versus prevention. First, Mr. Speaker, let us address the reality of modern workplace risks. The modern workplace is different. We see now rapid growth in jobs that feature exposure to new hazards. Just look at the structures taking shape on the slippery slopes of the Upper St. Andrew hillsides. All right, the new tower on Surbiton Road that eclipses the height of the 18-floor Jamaica Pegasus Hotel. Have the scaffolding, safety nets, and cables that were used 20 years ago come up higher? Pun intended, but alas, I digress. Yet, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's legal framework remains outdated, still heavily reliant on older legislation like the Factories Act of 1943. The proposed, not at this time, the proposed Occupational Safety and Health Bill that Jamaica has been playing ping pong with for years was designed to fix this. But alas, here we are, without implementation of strong standards and enforcement. It risks being symbolic rather than effective, not at this time. This concern is reinforced by research from the University of the West Indies, which highlights that across the Caribbean, many occupational safety and health laws are outdated or limited in scope. So the clash here is modernization versus the status quo. The opposition may suggest that current systems are sufficient, but the evidence shows otherwise. The warrant is clear: as work evolves, not at this time, outdated laws fail to regulate new dangers, leading directly to preventable injuries and deaths. You may go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned that the standards are outdated, but the government has a history of developing standards for occupational health and safety. We have the building codes, we have the Factories Act, we have the Sexual Harassment Act, we have the Data Protection Act, we have the Standards Act, we have the Public Health Act.
All right, I'm going to cut you right there. Many of those acts are relevant to specific things, but the government has a responsibility to put an Occupational Safety and Health Act in place to deal with risks within the workplace. So sexual harassment is not quite covered under risks in the workplace. Data protection, etc., etc., etc. That's not the point at this time. I am moving on. No, ma'am, I will not be taking any more points from you. Mr. Speaker, we must also confront the issue of protecting vulnerable and informal workers. In Jamaica, a large portion of the workforce operates in small construction, vending, domestic work, and agricultural employment sectors where regulation is weakest. Here, the clash is selective protection versus universal coverage. The opposition may argue for flexibility, no sir, but in practice, that leaves the most vulnerable unprotected. Regional evidence shows that occupational, may I go ahead with my speech, please? And occupational safety and health is often neglected in developing Caribbean states with weak enforcement and low awareness. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, safer workplaces reduce the burden on public systems. Injured workers often rely on facilities such as KPH, placing strain on limited healthcare resources. The warrant here is preventative. Stronger safety standards reduce injuries, which reduces hospital visits. No, don't do it, and lowers people's public health care costs. This is not just labor policy. It is national economic and public health planning. This is strongly supported by global health evidence. And I could go into the details, but I will not give you all of it. Safe to say that 2.1% of all global deaths and 2.7% of the global disease burden are caused by occupational risks. And the ILO goes on to highlight that workplace hazards such as stress can contribute to so many things: musculoskeletal disorders, hypertension, NCDs, even immune system dysfunction, and the list goes on. To make this even more concrete, consider heat stress. Jamaica is a prime candidate, right? ILO estimates that 2.4 billion workers globally are exposed to excessive heat, resulting in over 22 million non-fatal injuries and nearly 19,000 deaths annually. Mr. Speaker, we must address the most important clash of all. And by the way, Jamaica is at risk without enforced standards such as rest breaks, ventilation, or cooling systems, these injuries, and these must be systems that are driven by legislation, not at the whim and fancy of the employer. Mr. Speaker, we must address the most important clash of all: human right versus pure economic efficiency. The opposition treats safety as a negotiable expense. We reject that entirely. Now, as far back as 2009, former Labour Minister Pernell Charles Sr. made it clear that strong safety laws protect both workers and businesses by reducing chaos and improving productivity. Yet 17 years later, a new generation has emerged in the person of Pernell Charles Jr., and the bill remains unrealized while bills pile up. How much longer must workers remain exposed to risks we already understand? Mr. Speaker, when we weigh these clashes, the conclusion is unavoidable. Investment outweighs cost. Universal protection outweighs selective coverage. Regulation outperforms neglect. Prevention is better than reaction. And human rights must come before profit. The opposition speaks about cost but ignores consequence. The real cost is not regulation. The real cost is inaction, preventable injury, preventable illness, and preventable death. Strengthening workplace health and safety standards is not a burden. It's an investment in a safer, fairer, and more productive Jamaica. I urge this House to support the motion. And with that, I rest.
We thank you, Madam Second Speaker on the proposition team. We now call upon this second speaker from the opposition team to respond and to advance the opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, members of the proposition, I heard you mention that, the health and safety this health and safety bill is not yet gazetted. However, based on our research, there is an operational health and safety unit at the Ministry of Labor and Social Security dedicated to ensuring that there is guidance to ensure that persons are held if they are in contempt, and also supporting them to reach the standards. We also have companies like the Victoria Mutual, the Carib Cement, etc., that have been working, and their bills are on par with international agencies. You are saying that, there may be things and things may happen. However, I'm wondering, where are you getting your statistics? Since the Industrial Dispute Tribunal only referred to 132 disputes where labor laws came in, and 73.5% were about unfair dismissal, not accepted, and termination. The proposition request for strengthened standards at increased costs is understandable, since they do not seem to understand, or maybe they trivialize, the socio-economic repercussions of such a move. Safety happens through enforcement and accountability, not merely by piling new rules that the current system cannot even enforce and businesses cannot afford.
Point of information.
Not accepted. Now let us examine the real-world impact of these increased costs. The proposition pretends businesses will absorb them, but in reality, costs do not disappear. They are passed on to employees, consumers, or reflected in reduced opportunities. Mr. Speaker, let us talk about the 1.6 times multiplier effect of regulatory burden. According to the Innovation, Service and Economic Development Canada 2020, for every 1% increase in compliance costs, there is a 1.6 decrease in revenue for businesses. Now, in a country like Jamaica, where businesses 40 to 45% of the economy are informal, as reported by the ILO, this effect is even more pronounced. Many small businesses already struggle to meet compliance. According to the IDB's study on the informal sector in Jamaica, micro and small businesses at the time only met 36% of, not at this time, requirements for formality, adding further costs, other costs for force businesses into a corner with these three options. One, to become informal. If they become informal, people will lose all their employee benefits such as NHT, NIS, etc., along with other factors, and they may be forced to work in conditions that are even more subpar. Secondly, they will just make persons redundant to stay compliant. Jobs will be sacrificed to compensate for the additional incurred costs. And finally, they may just shut down, where every single job will be lost. And even though this effect may not happen for every single business, the risk is absolutely significant when MSMEs make up 97.6% of enterprise and employ 80% of people in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, these are large numbers. This is a classic case of deja vu. We've seen changes in standards have had employee effects. In December 29, 2019, the Jamaica Gleaner headline read, Wisynco cuts 100 jobs ahead of styrofoam ban. One environmental regulation strengthened, and 100 Jamaicans were unemployed even before it took effect. And please note, Wisynco is a massive organization with capital and market share. If a giant like Wisynco could cut 100 jobs just because of one standard, what chance does a local cook shop have? This is the sudden destruction of our workforce, and that is the impact on employees. But what about consumers? According to GIS 2025, cost-push inflation occurs when businesses face higher production costs. I'm sorry to say, we'll be seeing this cost push very soon, if not already. Just yesterday, we were told in a Gleaner article that consumers should brace for a new round of price increases on May 1st as three food manufacturing giants, Grace Kennedy, Separate and Wisynco, begin passing on the cost of the new sugar tax. Chairman from Wisynco, William Mafu, did not even sugarcoat it. The price increases range, not at this time, from as low as 5% to 25%, and manufacturers have no choice but to pass on the cost to consumers. Now, with more people jobless or forced into the shadows of informal employment, our public assistance programs will be flooded. Path, poor relief, the rehabilitation program will be oversaturated with requests. And then again, where's this money coming from? These programs are funded by the tax revenues of our businesses, our employees, and our consumers. By suffocating the taxpayers, you risk the collapsing of our social safety net. No income, no NIS means healthcare becomes a luxury and nutrition plummets. When adults and children are malnourished, they are at greater risk for developmental challenges and NCDs. Earlier mentioned about morality. The limited resources available will go to survival instead of things like education. No, the proposition may say we're being dramatic. It's all theatrics, but the evidence is glaring. We say fix it, enforcement first, build capacity, and then strengthen where necessary. The opposition rests.
Thank you very much. The second speaker that was on the opposition team. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move to the second segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the proposition team, Team Jamaica Information Service, gets a chance to ask their questions first of the opposition team, Team Early Childhood Commission. Team JIS, you may proceed now with your 3 questions.
Okay, first of all, I invite the speaker who just ended to explain what you mean by fix it enforcement first, because it sounds like you're saying the same thing.
when we're saying enforcement first, before we need to see baseline data and what are the things that we're getting out of these standards. Before we start putting in more standards, we have to rectify what we are seeing, identify the gaps, and strengthen those first before we start putting in more standards. Because enforcing new standards does not mean that there would be increased compliance.
If a worker is injured on the job due to inadequate safety standards, who should bear the cost, the worker or the employer?
That's not what the debate is about.
If a worker is injured on the job due to inadequate safety standards, who should bear the cost, the worker or the employer?
That is not what we're debating. In a case like that, you have health insurance that each individual companies would have to protect their employees. What we're saying is that at what cost should the business enforce or strengthen additional standards?
Is worker safety a right or a cost?
It is a right, but again, how can workers be safe if they are without jobs, if they're unemployed, if they're subjected to poverty as a result of your proposition? Because remember, 80% of the workforce is employed by MSMEs. 46% of employees are informally employed. So when you strengthen standards and you increase costs, how are you protecting them?
And we're saying enforce the ones that we currently have. We believe that there is weak enforcement of the existing standards.
We thank both teams for this segment of this phase of cross-examination. We continue now with the second phase, inviting at this time the opposition team to pose their questions.
All right, so the second proposition speaker said that more bills are piling up. But isn't that the government's problem?
How could it possibly be the government's problem that bills are piling up because the workers, the employers have not put things in place to ensure that the workers are safe? If they don't put things in place to ensure that the workers are safe, I'm not just talking about the bill to the employer and the worker. I'm also talking about the bill to the public health system, because people are going into the public health system that do not need to be there, wasting public resources.
All right, you said a number of occupational accidents have been reported, but how do you prove that that is a lack on the business's part when accidents can happen amidst the presence of standards?
That's immaterial when you put an act in place that everyone has to follow. You don't have to spend your time trying to figure out whose fault it is, because when you put the act in place and you put the regulations and the enforcement criteria in place, then that will ensure that accidents, we are not saying accidents will not happen, less accidents will happen, and then the liability will come based on whether or not the employer put the necessary actions in place.
And ultimately, where we do accept that there is personal responsibility that falls on the worker when you're at work, ultimately, it is the employer's responsibility to ensure that workers are protected, to put in place policies, practices, and procedures to make sure that they are safeguarded when they're there. Because if not them, then who? Rights are not things that comes with cost.
Or conditions.
All right, so how would increased cost plus strengthened standards equate to stronger compliance amongst the businesses?
I think we're conflating things here because compliance is not what we're discussing. However, if you want to speak to compliance, then you can look at the outdated act which you mentioned, which you said is sufficient. People aren't compliant to that because the Factories Act only speaks to a very specific sector. So you mentioned the Division of Occupational Safety and Health, which primarily registers factories and does tests there. There's large sectors of the population that are not covered under that. So by your own admission, it's insufficient.
All right, thank you both teams for concluding the second segment, or rather phase of cross-examination. All right, so we are going to take a pause, a 1 minute pause offered to both teams, which gives you the opportunity to really fine tune those reply speeches. At the end of the 1 minute pause, we'll resume with the reply speaker, their presentation from the opposition team, and then we'll conclude with that speech from the proposition team. Teams, your 1 minute pause begins now. That signals the end of the pause. We now begin with the, or rather resume, with the presentation from the third and final speaker from Team Early Childhood Education Commission to anchor the opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The proposition has spent the last few minutes trying to sell us a story, but this debate isn't about safety versus cost. It is about safety at whose cost and at what cost, and that boils down to facts and fiction. And right now, the proposition, or should I say the Jamaica Inflation Service, is trying to sell us a story that would only make sense in an alternate universe. If we ought to consider the complexities of a developing country and the lived realities of every single Jamaican, what they are supporting is absolutely preposterous. They say that the Occupational Health and Safety Act bill has not been gazetted, but despite that, the government has moved ahead of that and started implementation. I mentioned the Safe Worker Program, the Voluntary Compliance Program, which helps to get businesses up to standard. Upon research, I saw multiple organizations have developed their own occupational health and safety standards as early as 2013. Victoria Mutual, Carib Cement, JPS, ASSL, a lot of organizations have been proactive. They keep referring to the Factories Act. We have mentioned multiple standards. We talk about Public Health Act, sexual harassment, we talk about data protection. Aren't those responsible for health and safety of workers as well? Now let us talk about who really pays for their dream, because they assume that businesses will absorb cost, but businesses don't absorb cost. People do. The consumers, the employees. MSMEs are 97.6% of enterprises, and they employ 80% of workforce. So when you legislate the cost on the backbone of the country's economy, who really pays? Everybody. Not to mention the businesses would rather to go underground. The IDB said it. Micro and small businesses are already struggling to gain formality. So when you strengthen the cost and you strengthen the standards, how will they survive? We are not supporting lawlessness. We are also not contending that health and safety aren't paramount. What we are saying is that the socio-economic death of Jamaica is the ultimate health and safety standard. The proposition posits that stronger standards will result in safer workplaces, but we have shown that Jamaica's core issue is already the enforcement. So if you can't enforce existing ones, how are you going to enforce strengthened one? Bureau of International Affairs told us Jamaica's inspectors are insufficient. The MLSS annual report showed us only 60% of the accidents that qualified for investigation were investigated. And might I add, that number of accidents that were qualified for investigation for an entire year were 121 accidents. Up to last week, the nation watched in horror as a consumer pulled metal fragments out of his sugar using a fridge magnet. This wasn't a backdoor sugar, by the way. This was the Frome Sugar Factory, a massive registered company governed by the Factories Act, the Standards Act, the Public Health Act, and the Sugar Industry Authority. And despite the mountains of standard, this was only caught after a viral video. But what I am saying today, JIS reported only 600 factories still remain unregistered. What I'm saying, the standards exist. The government is already struggling to implement the existing standards. Why would you want to add strengthened ones? And why would you want to add these at a cost that would be to the detriment of the very businesses themselves? The proposition also argues that we value cost over lives, but they want safety at any cost. Mr. Speaker, what quality of life do you have when you can't even afford to live? Unemployment and poverty are the most expensive health and safety risk in Jamaica. When people can't afford to live, they get desperate. Desperation looks like bridging JPS light, developmental delays for children, dumpling and butter every night, increasing NCDs and illnesses as they mentioned. The very safety that the proposition claims to cherish is what they are obliterating for masses. You don't protect life by making it unlivable. The health and safety of all Jamaicans is a shared priority, but it cannot be realized through this suicide. You don't protect people by increasing standards and business costs when you cannot even enforce or sustain existing ones. Accidents that happen in workplaces doesn't also mean an absence of standards. Not because accidents are reported doesn't mean that the workplace doesn't have standards. Jamaica doesn't suffer from the absence of standards, but from gaps in monitoring and enforcement that we need to target first. This is facts versus fiction, and the fiction they present makes a wonderful fairy tale, but a self-destructive standard we beg to oppose.
Indeed, we thank the third speaker, the reply speaker from the opposition team, Team Early Childhood Commission. We now call upon to conclude this debate, the third and final speaker from the proposition team, Team GIS. Let's make him welcome. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, we seem to be having two separate debates here today. The opposition the outcomes, because if a business cannot afford to operate humanely and implement basic protections for its workers, can it truly afford to operate? The proposition also seems to be advocating for the deregulation of businesses and allowing for enterprise to continue unchecked, and we all know how that will turn out. Fortunately for this honorable house, the Jamaica Information Service is here to bring you facts. We have heard many arguments today, some compelling and others less so. Our job today is not merely a matter of economics, convenience, or expediency. It is to show you that the dignity and safety of hundreds of thousands of hard-working Jamaicans who do not currently enjoy many of the safeguards that are expected of a modern workplace take precedence over the proverbial bottom line. Today we're defining not what it means to be a successful business, but what it means to be a sustainable one with humane work, conditions, and practices. First, let me address the opposition's claims that costs will cripple businesses. They want you to fall into the trap of treating cost as a reason to deny strengthened standards that protect employees. My second speaker has already addressed the issue of cost, but let me take it further. These increased measures are not simply line items on an expense report. They're investments in people who will ultimately be your ultimate resource for a successful enterprise. We contend that measures such as the implementation of the Occupational Safety and Health Bill are not just recommended, but absolutely necessary in an economy where the most of the nation's labor force are not protected under the current Factories Act of 1943. That includes the financial sector, the agricultural sector, shops and offices, and the public sector. That means you, my worthy opponents, are not covered under the current legislation. How do you argue against that? We understand that costs may be prohibitive in the implementation of health and safety standards, but let me ask, Can businesses afford to not make these investments, to not prioritize employee health, to not operate within a modern, leaning business environment? This government entirely rejects that. Are the upfront costs not worth it when contrasted to possible medical bills, workplace accidents, or a possible lawsuit? What is the dollar value that is deemed too much for a human life? We did not come here to negate the concerns of our opposition, and we have brought you solutions of scalability. Do what you can, when you can, but it should be done. They say small businesses will not survive this burden, but ignore the benefit of our proposals. The requirements that we see from Ras I's organic juice business will not be the same as the customs agency, which has billions of dollars at its disposal. We want to ensure that the most important protections are prioritized, with others being added incrementally as businesses grow and profits increase. The opposition's case relies on existing frameworks being sufficient, but that collapses when we examine them. So the Factories Act of 1943 is just that, a law which regulated some businesses that operated under very different conditions more than 8 decades ago. My opponents, the phones we used 15 years ago are now obsolete. So how do we expect the standards of 80 years ago to be relevant today? At the time of being drafted, the primary concerns were insufficient safety gear and high-risk manual labor. In today's modern environment, we have to contend with so much more. So what are the provisions in place for stress-related ailments, for burnout, for data privacy, for new chemicals, for chronic musculoskeletal conditions that are driven by a sedentary lifestyle, which we all operate in now? Additionally, when the opposition tells you that the adaptation and the implementation of costs is impossible for small businesses, we have already lived through proof of that. During the COVID-19 pandemic, millions of people died, and we saw hundreds of thousands of businesses across the world shuttered in the face of this new foe. But as more information unfolded and science explored the evolving virus, we adapted and became stronger. In short order, maintaining 6 feet distance became the norm. Businesses integrated sanitization stations, distributed masks to employees, created safety divides, and instituted remote work. So adaptation is not theoretical, it is proven. At the core of this debate, it comes down to a simple comparison. On their side, the considerations are speculative costs to businesses. On ours, real and ongoing risks to human life and well-being. Even if there is a cost, the scale and certainty of harm we prevent with our proposals far outweigh the costs. I rest.
We have come to the end of this match. We thank both teams for their contributions, and upon the signal from our moderator, we will leave as the panel of adjudicators to deliberate.
Thank you so much, Jermaine. A very hotly contested match. Ladies and gentlemen, give our teams another round of applause. The arguments have been made in conclusion of this last day of matches with the Jamaica Information Service and the Early Childhood Commission. They debated the moot, be it resolved that the government should strengthen workplace health and safety standards even if it increases the costs for businesses. Now all that's left is for our team of adjudicators to take a short break and adjudicate and come back with the winning team's information. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned.
Welcome one and all. Welcome back to this match. We're at the end, about to disclose the triumphant, the winning team. And of course, I give you some analysis as to the justification behind the decision. I want to begin by extending a strong round of applause to both teams on a job well done. We recognize that both teams were nearly evenly matched. The scores reflect that, 274 as compared to 271 points. So 3 points separating both teams. Okay. Now, we were discussing, we were debating, the teams were engaging in a little bit of a verbal tussle over the question, so whether or not the government of Jamaica should impose regulations having to do with occupational health and safety, the overall well-being of workers, even if it is that these regulations impose higher costs to companies and businesses at large. Team proposition contends that this is necessary, and they provide some sort of principled justification for it from the opening speaker's presentation, right? To include, government having an obligation to see to it that, workers and its various constituents are well off and are attended to and their welfare maximized. They contend as well that there are some deficits, and by the time we get to the second speaker is where we kind of get the deficits in the status quo principally. We heard from the first speaker that we don't have the occupational health and safety legislation implemented. It is yet to be sort of regulated and infused across the system. But we get some other harms that exist insofar as the workplace has evolved. It has become modernized. And in the world of Team JIS, the legislation is lacking and lagging. We need more modern legislation to treat with, as the second speaker from the proposition team contends. The realities of, for example, businesses going up to heights that never really existed in the past, the issues of mental health being more pervasive and more significant. Our appreciation as a society of these issues is more pertinent, and therefore we need legislation that responds and is more responsive to those particular concerns. On the opposition team, we get from the outset a kind of, dare I say, bashing of the government. They say to us that the government is not acting appropriately insofar as it is not doing enough to police and enforce the legislation that exists. They say that there are huge deficits, and we hear that those characterizations coming out of the first opposition speaker, right? I want to pause a little bit and kind of give some analysis as to how we treated that particular contribution from the opposition team. We contend that the motion does not, or the moot rather, does not require the implementation of new legislation. It may very well be about the government imposing greater regulation over legislation that exists already, or using the legislation and sort of enacting it more in a more stringent and a more uniformed fashion. If that is the case, then that does impose higher cost to businesses, which in our mind sounds to us from the opposition's vantage point as though they're defending a world that ought rightly to be defended by the proposition team in this debate. That's one concern. Another concern we have is in relation to the argumentation we get from proposition. We think that a moot like this demands some kind of an estimation of the cost that will be borne by companies from these regulations. We feel like team proposition does not give us anything tangible or even close to tangible to cause us to recognize that there is a financial burden, but that burden in their mind is justified by virtue of the benefits that are to be had. We find this to be an interesting neglect on the part of proposition, because it does not give opposition anything tangible to say, well, these are the costs, and they think that the costs are unjustified. What opposition does is not so much challenge the government to come with tangible sort of indication as to what the costs are going to be, or for them on-side opposition to listen to proposition, kind of come with some kind of an estimation as to what the increased costs are going to be based on proposition's model, and then say, well, these costs are unjustified. What they do instead from their second speaker is to present us with some, what we consider to be some significant harms to businesses in their world. They say to us that businesses are going to have to pay for the regulation. I think the mood does imply that that will happen. But what we consider to be a concern from our vantage point as a panel is, to what extent are the harms being articulated by the opposition team? To what extent are they real? Could it be that they are a bit alarmist? Will companies implode and collapse, and will they be devastated? Will we have the kinds of job losses that team opposition contends will unfold? We think that there was a little bit of an exaggeration on the part of opposition, and this is how we arrive at that conclusion. From the second speaker on team proposition's case, we get three fundamental things that they want to bring about in their world. They want to, one, have regulations having to do with buildings and the aesthetics and making those buildings better suited for the health and safety of workers. They would also want to attend to the mental health of citizens, of workers rather, right? To ensure that that condition is treated with better on. And then ultimately they want to impose and implement more stringently the occupation health and safety legislation. Those are the three big characterizations that we get predominantly from the second speaker of team proposition. Now, we don't think that those bits of sort of changes or alterations with the status quo are likely to lead to as drastic a detriment to businesses as was characterized by team opposition. Certainly opposition doesn't help us to see that those things will happen. So it's one thing in a debate when you say, well, there are going to be these harms. You must make those harms seem real to the context that is being advocated for by the proposition team. Otherwise, it feels a little bit as though these are risks that may materialize, but we're not sure if the materialization of those risks are to the extent that are being postulated by the opposition team. Okay? So those are sort of the concerns that we weighed in the deliberation in terms of coming to an assessment of this debate. Again, the scores are close, but they are fairly good scores. Not hugely impressive, but really good scores. Again, the scores are as follows: 274 points to the winning team, 271 points to the second place team. Ladies and gentlemen, the winners of this match in round one of the public sector debate competition of 2026, the fifth iteration, they are the Jamaica Information Service Team Proposition. There's a big concern in the debate, the placement of argumentation. So what we get from the second speaker on proposition should have rightly come from the first speaker to help us to see, one, what the deficits are clearer, as clear as we got it from the second proposition. And importantly, we got no measurement of the cost principally from the opposition team. But similarly from opposition, we get the placement of argumentation in the second speaker's presentation to include, for example, the cost, the detrimental impact on the economy, businesses being disinclined to employ workers, laying off workers, passing on cost to the consumer and so forth. Those are principled arguments and pragmatic arguments as well that ought rightly to have come from the first speaker, and maybe some abandonment of the arguments surrounding the there is a hypocrisy of government and the reduced qualification of the government to impose these measures. Maybe that was not as strategic set of argumentation from the opposition team. All right? But nevertheless, the best debater, before I get to the best debater, the commendable debater, and this, we don't oftentimes do this, but I'll do this in this match, highlighting a commendable debater. The commendable debater comes from the second place team Early Childhood Commission. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the second speaker on that team. The best debater in this match overall, though, comes to us from the winning team, Team JIS, and that is the second speaker on that team. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of day 2 of this competition. We know you've enjoyed it. We thank you for being a part of the experience with us, and we look forward to having you on board again tomorrow to watch the final set of matches in round 1 of the public sector debate competition.